Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining this session. You are now at Engaging Rural Eastern Shore Communities in Climate Solutions. So with this, I'd like to pass it to Karen to start the session.
Okay, thank you all for joining. I am here with Barbara Brown-Wilson. We're both from the University of Virginia, and we're going to be talking today about a interdisciplinary research project that we have on the eastern shore of Virginia, funded by the National Science Foundation Coast and People Program, that's focused on engaging rural communities in climate solutions. And so I will be giving an overview of the project. I'll show a brief video and then segue to Barbara, who will be talking about the work that we're doing with regional communities on the Eastern Shore in the research on climate solutions. So like many rural coastal communities, people are disproportionately and intensely impacted by climate change. One of the reasons is that these communities tend to be geographically, and in some cases, socially isolated. They tend not to be as well served by science and often don't have government or institutional infrastructures to support decision-making or data-informed decision-making. On the Eastern Shore of Virginia, there's many towns that are actually not incorporated, so they have no governance structure. You all know, since this Mid-Atlantic Conference, that the coast of Virginia is a hotspot for climate change. We have triple the global average of sea level rise. We have 5 times the amount of, quote, sunny day flooding, where you don't have to have a storm surge to have flooding on the coast. And our 100-year record shows that storms are becoming more frequent in this part of the United States. On the Eastern Shore, you can see the population density here, less than 10 people per square kilometer. And it's actually declining slightly and expected to continue over the next 15 years. And about 1/3 of the children who live in this community are below the poverty line. So this is an area where people are particularly burdened by the effects of climate change. So like many rural coasts, the Eastern Shore is dealing with sea level rise, accelerated sea level rise, storm surge, inland flooding, the salinization or the saltwater intrusion into groundwater. And this is impacting livelihoods across the community, from drinking water to functioning septic systems to fresh water for agriculture. And one of the things that's sort of unique about the Eastern Shore is it's really, really flat. The highest point is along the spine of the peninsula, and that's just 15 meters above sea level at its highest point. So we see, as you can see in this picture, we see ghost forests, which are basically where the salt marsh is migrating inland from sea level rise and killing the trees, causing this ghost forest. And here you can see some of the flooding that has occurred in our communities. The bottom center here is where there was a road washout, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second, because that's an example of where community input has really influenced how we think about climate risks on the coast. So the goal of this project is essentially to develop a decision support tool or platform to use data and modeling to help different stakeholders in the community make informed decisions that can increase equity in terms of resources and knowledge for adaptation on the coast. We describe this as co-production, and that's exactly what it is. We are working very closely with communities to define the research goals, the research priorities, the research methods. And that's a really important aspect of the work that we're doing to make sure that it's relevant and impactful, potentially impactful and helpful for communities. And Barbara will talk a lot about how we're working in detail with the communities, but I just wanted to highlight one point here as an intro to that, is that we have 2 community leaders, Karen Downing and Andre Elliott, who serve on the overall leadership team of the project. So they are our main connection to the community members. They're the ones who devise the advisory committee. They're also sit on our, as I mentioned, our leadership team. So they're involved in decision making. We share the power of the research with them. So they're very integral. And this graphic just shows these are the research team members, and here's our advisory committee members, just sort of equal in number. So how does this atlas work? What we're doing is developing a kind of a spatially explicit mapping tool that is underlain by environmental data and models on groundwater availability, groundwater salinization, coastal flooding, inland flooding, land use, land cover, and then overlaying on that data on social science, social economic aspects, and also demographic data. And importantly, as I mentioned, the integration of the community members from a number of different sectors on how they're interacting with each other, how they're getting information, how they're perceiving information. They're giving us back information to help make this tool relevant. And this is, as I said, a 5-year project. We're in about halfway through it right now. So this is a graphic that one of Barbara's team created to communicate to community members what we're thinking about. And I wanted to put it here just to remind you that, again, we're talking about modeling and data on groundwater and storm surge and how that's affected by climate, both now and using it in the future. So we're thinking about water security. We're also thinking about mobility, getting access to resources if there's a storm that occurs, thinking about road washouts, and also the failure of septic systems. So the community aspect is really important in how we're devising our research. We have multiple workshops. Barbara will go into some detail about how we do it. These are just a couple of pictures here. The one on the left, I really love. It's a timeline that Barbara's team created for people to give us input on how the Eastern Shore has changed, both in their lifetime, but in the narratives of their families. And then we have different ways that community members engage with us. But their perception of the issues is really important to driving the research that we're doing. And so I wanted to give a couple examples of how this co-production has worked. We first started focusing on, as I mentioned, storm flooding, so modeling storm surge, saltwater intrusion to groundwater, how land use affects groundwater recharge and groundwater withdrawal. And what we learned from the community was this was all very important, but also really important was inland flooding and road washouts. That was something we hadn't thought about or were aware of prior to starting this project with the community members. And also the importance of flooding and groundwater levels on failing septic systems. So in the center here is a picture of Karen Downing, one of our community leaders, and here's Andre, another community leader. This is an example of sort of how people are understanding how stakeholders are engaging with each other. We put a few sticky notes down, and then the community really embellished that, those social network information for us. So here are a couple examples. One is where we looked at how inland flooding and storm surge can cause road washouts. And in this case, there are a number of places on the Eastern Shore that are these necks, which is what's here, and just a single access road that connects the mainland of the peninsula to the neck. And what we found, what we learned from the community was it wasn't just storm surge, but it was the inland flooding. There were 10 inches of rain in this case. This is in September 2018, where, following a storm surge, there was a massive amount of freshwater runoff that caused the washout of the bridge and isolated this community. And you can see here some of the tide level data. And this is just to show that it was after the high tide. It was at the lower tide where we had the road washout. The water level was really coming from the inland. And so again, that sort of puts a punctuation point on the input of the community members. So developing groundwater models and hydrologic models, we can begin to characterize what are the conditions that cause these kinds of road washouts and apply this to other areas on the peninsula. The main land uses in the Eastern Shore are poultry, crop production, pine plantations. There's an increase in solar farm relocation on the Eastern Shore. This is a big Amazon solar farm, and also domestic water use. So we're looking at how these different land uses affect both groundwater recharge and groundwater withdrawal, and how that influences the susceptibility of the groundwater aquifer to saltwater intrusion from sea level rise and storm surge. And here's just an example of what those kind of models look like. This is for a small watershed within the overall peninsula. And the idea is we take these small watersheds and we make these really detailed high resolution models work and talk to each other, and then we expand that to the entire peninsula. So here's just showing how the depth of the groundwater varies depending on the elevation, the topography, the time of year, and the rainfall, and the land uses. And that's the bluer color is the deeper groundwater, and the yellower color is the shallow. So you see some variation between hot August, summer, and February. And again, this is important because groundwater depth is an important factor for septic system functioning on the shore. There's a minimum groundwater depth that's required. So we're also measuring and estimating storm surge using the ADCIRC model. And that allows us to look at how storm surge affects these communities, both on the Chesapeake Bay side and the ocean side. For different kinds of hurricanes and nor'easters. In this case, we took the high resolution data and aggregated it to the census block just to show the pattern. And what you can see in the darker colors is that you have higher storm surge on the seaside, which makes sense, and on the southern end of the peninsula. So these census block groups. But in the blue circles are areas where we have the highest flooding. And that's because flooding is obviously a function both of the elevation of the land, but also of the storm surge. So these are really low-lying areas. And then we can take these data, these models for storm surge, and project forward to forecast what it might look like in 2050. So for example, here's Hurricane Isabel, that same storm. On the left is what actually happened in 2003. And on the right is what would happen in 2050 with an increase in wind speed, which we have shown from our long-term data, and also an increase in sea level. So you can begin to use these to look at map out future scenarios. And we're integrating these models. This shows how water levels for this storm surge and the groundwater models are integrated. So we can look at total inundation. And this is just you'll see, this just shows over tidal cycles what part of the watershed is flooded to what water depth. So this is 2 meters in the dark purple. So that's a lot of water. So all of this is to assess climate risk in different parts of the peninsula. So here's just a prototype. This is what the Equity Atlas will look like. This is just that first layer of the socioeconomic data, the social and demographic data. And you can map it based on primary indicators and secondary indicators, things like health and population, education, jobs, and begin to look at how these are changing. And we will overlay on this the environmental data on the storm surge modeling, the inland flooding, and the groundwater salinization. So we'll begin to be able to layer up the different components of risk and what influences equity. So I'm gonna, in a second, segue to a short part of a short movie just to sort of highlight some of these key points. You'll hear from Karen and Andre, our community leaders. I just wanted to make, these sort of key things. One is that this is an interactive decision support tool. It's designed to live beyond the life of the study, which is both an opportunity and a challenge. The co-production means that we're getting real data, real priorities, real information from community members that will make it most valuable to them. And so they're really helping to drive the research. And then finally, the last point is that it takes a long time to do something like this, to build the trusted partnerships, to build the networks of people and communication, to make something like this sustainable so that it will last beyond the initial 5-year duration of the project. So I'm going to show a little bit of this movie, and then I'll stop and pass it on to Barbara.
The Environmental Institute at the University of Virginia is a hub of interdisciplinary research, training, and partnerships that are focused on connecting our research with policy and practice.
The mission of the Institute is to build and support teams to solve some of the most vexing environmental problems that we face related to climate and environmental change. Many of the challenges that we face don't fit neatly into traditional academic disciplines. And so you might have a problem associated with stormwater that an environmental engineer might be able to tackle, but you might have a related problem about housing that you need urban planners or you need economists or environmental scientists to help solve.
About half the world's population lives along the coast. And so this is really a hotspot for climate risk and addressing climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So climate change is a global phenomenon, but the way people experience it is very local. So we need to make sure that our research is meeting the needs of those communities. The Climate Equity Project on Virginia's Eastern Shore is about addressing the disproportionate impact of climate on rural communities. We bring together researchers who study storm surge flooding, the salinization of groundwater, with those who think about how that impacts people. And we bring them together with community members to help identify what the priorities are and how our frontier research can address the needs of the community. I'm a computational modeler, so I spend most of my time looking at a computer screen. And as part of the Institute and as part of this project, I develop eco-hydrological models for watersheds along the Eastern Shore of Virginia. So we take in land use data and we take in elevation data and among a couple other things. And with that, we can output variables like stream flow, depth to water table, nitrogen export, carbon storage, anything that people are interested in. What working with the Institute has really taught me is how to translate that computational modeling into actual policy and to see community members being excited. And because they're like, wow, I didn't know we could do this with the model. And they're excited to test out different scenarios. So community engaged place-based research is really about co-production. It's about university researchers working with community members to address the climate-related needs in particular region.
My experience in working with the University of Virginia Environmental Institute has been one of enriching my knowledge about environmental science and equity, climate, as well as learning more about what UVA does in their research. The Eastern Shore is home to not only the people, but also to the wildlife. It's very important to us because we want to see it not only to survive, but to thrive. In order for our communities to thrive, we're going to have to look long-term and how we can best protect them. And that also means protecting our coastal waterways.
Having community members involved with combating climate change is super important because you need their buy-in. If community members aren't bought into the initiatives that come forth from climate research, then nothing's going to happen, nothing's going to change. You can do a million different things at the higher levels to try to affect change on the ground. But if you don't have the people that are living those experiences and living in those places bought in, then it's for nothing.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm now going to pass it on to Barbara Brown-Wilson and continue.
Thanks so much, Karen. Karen Downing and Andre Elliott already gave you a great background on why community engaged research needs to be kind of augmented from the way we normally do things in a research space. I will also say I'm an urban planning professor, so I not only care about environmental science, but also about communities and people in power. And I'm really interested in governance, how we make better decisions. And so for those of you that are the sort of dorks who want to have follow-up reading, and there's a really great piece that sort of looks at, okay, what is climate adaptation doing in an urban planning space and through the journal Science this year, or actually 2021, but it says there's the three things that they see in the work right now in practice, and I think this really embodies what we're trying to do, but in a more rural set of counties, having both a systems thinking approach. We're really thinking about system vulnerability, but having a sort of power sharing where the research really changes, as Karen McGlathery mentioned. And then with a notion that equity matters too, that really thinking not only about climate, but also about who is, bearing more of the burdens of these climate risks, and how do we make equitable decisions in the future towards those ends. So as Karen mentioned, Karen and Andre really crafted this leadership team. Karen is a pastor. Andre is the executive director of the YMCA. They both have deep roots in different parts of the two-county region, and really did some mapping of the stakeholders that might make decisions not in the government. So influencing the government in the way that they do things, but also thinking about the public school systems in both counties, thinking about the Chamber of Commerce, who cares for our aging populations, who cares for the nonprofits and the health district. So really trying to bring all those actors together. And we hold quarterly meetings where they're really the guides for the projects. Science team members will bring research questions to bear where they want, someone to hone in further, but often it's really the community advisory committee deciding what the research questions are, and driving the research towards something that's really relevant to their daily lives. As Karen mentioned, we're in year 3, so it changes. Co-produced research also must ebb and flow with what you learn together. Part of the magic is being together in a research team that hasn't existed before. So there is a way in which it's really different than what the proposal might have originally outlined. So far, we've been pretty close because I think the team did a great job of co-producing the proposal as well. But in year 3, we're realizing one of the things, besides just focusing on inland flooding, and a few other kind of septic issues and things that we knew were issues, but have become more important. We've also really focused on the next generation of young people, the next generation of resident leaders, and so expanding our work in that realm based on what we're hearing from our community partners. Early on, as we're making these interactive maps, we know that census groups are not actually the way that people think about their place. In a rural county, the census block has many different communities within it. So we did some place naming workshops, which was a good first activity for a lot of our community partners to be like, oh yeah, actually, I do know all about what this should be called and what that should be called. And so we did a lot of learning with them about what places matter and how to kind of call out an area that might contain many communities within it. Our first winter workshop, the winter is the time when in this, agriculturally focused and coastal community, the people are a little more free to focus on things like this. So we started with a winter workshop. We're now adding in a summer one too, because people want more than a yearly kind of big public workshop. But scientists had different stations, and it was kind of a fair style. I think one of our community advisory members was like, yes, a science fair. And so we've used that approach. And as Karen showed you, we had that timeline, but we've also had a lot of questions about actor network mapping, about understanding your relationship to water, also about what can you hear and what are your stories that you want to tell. So also bringing in some more kind of humanities focused thinking to this work. Through that first workshop, I know this is a very wordy slide, but I'll give you the highlights, and if you want to study instead, you can. But through that first workshop, we really identified 5 key questions that community members are most passionate about. Number 4 is one where we're bringing in partners that are actually better suited to answer it, but the others are driving a lot of the work that we're doing. And we've since tried to identify, okay, what's the way that we're answering each one of these questions? What are the methods? How do we do this together? What matters in the work we're doing? And we had an idealized engagement cycle of like, okay, so youth are more free in the summer, farmers are not. and, really tried to get a sense of who wants to engage and when. And we've ended up having this be more ideal than realized. There's a lot of work that happens in and out of sync. And we, as I said, are adding another annual workshop in because of the passion for those. We've showed up at other events. That's always a really successful thing when we're invited. So we were invited here to Juneteenth last year and had a wonderful set of conversations, just learning about what matters to people, where their climate stories are, what they're curious about, what their hopes are, what their fears are about living on the Eastern Shore. And then because we're doing this in a co-produced way, it's really methodologically messy, but I think in a way that's actually allows for people to come and meet us where they are. We've found that oral histories are sometimes the way that people feel most comfortable. They can talk in their native language, they can speak from their own lived experience. And we have some colleagues through Virginia Humanities that are doing really high level oral histories that are also not only working with the public libraries, but also going into their kind of statewide database and being curated for a With Good Reason episode. So I think some people really want to make sure the message is getting out broadly. Others want to do personal interviews, either from their professional expertise, from their position as a decision maker, from, because they want to talk also maybe about something private, like their septic system, or an employer that maybe pollutes, chicken processing plants are one of the major employers here. And that's a real challenge in terms of the environmental injustices that are identified by communities nearby. And then focus groups are often a really great place to tell stories about the collective experience of what happens when a road is flooded and kids can't get to school, or elders can't get their medicines. And then, as we've already discussed, community events and interactive workshops have been perhaps the most successful ways to have a dialogue that includes high-level hydrology, but also really deep exchanges on and how that relates to lived expertise. The value of graphic-based advocacy has been, I think, maybe surprisingly important here for all of us. We have a couple incredibly talented graduate students. This is some work of Daniel Wright, as the next piece that I'll show you is. We realized early on that that these concepts like saltwater intrusion and paleo channels are very jargon rich and not easily accessible, even in English, much less if you speak a different first language. So we've really leaned on the graphic talents of some of our grad students to help us translate concepts that feel really important to the people we're hearing from, but also complicated in terms of the ways in which they contain multitudes of information that you need to understand as it relates to fresh water supply, as it relates to septic systems, as it relates to salinization of soils. One big thing that we heard and saw was that people really need to understand the language differently. Climate equity doesn't land for many people. And so we started working on a couple different graphics. This is a poster. So these are the two sides of the poster. And it's been incredibly well received as a way to talk about, climate risks, social systems vulnerabilities, and social burdens, but in a way that's very beautiful, also really centers the kind of magic of the Eastern Shore, all the wonderful things about this place, and communicates those together. So it's not saying, this is only a place that has all these challenges, but also this is a place with ridiculously beautiful sunsets and incredibly strong people that work together to clear a road when it's been blocked by a fallen tree. So it's just a real point of magic for the way this team's able to learn together. We work very closely with the community college and the science team there very closely with local middle schoolers and some we're starting to work closer with some Chesapeake Bay Foundation camps and other things. So this is actually becoming a resource for those young people and their parents, which is exciting. We've started to do informational interviews with key actors because a big point of learning in the actor network is also figuring out how to model different possible actions that could be taken and their effects on the climate risks, but also the social burdens. And so really understanding what those actions are. We're also doing a fair amount of content analysis to understand what are the plans that have already been enacted. We're doing this closely with the Eastern Shore PDC and the Planning District Commission, and so anyway, we're trying to draw from a number of different knowledges, professional and lived expertise, and we're hearing the same set of really important kind of challenges repeated by both types of knowledge, and also building out this hub is about making the connections between those groups. So sometimes these interactions in the workshops are not just about trying to get knowledge, but also trying to build those interconnections in ways that are sustained well beyond our presence as a part of the team. And so yeah, we're finding that there's a set of relationships that this project has been building that are new to the environmental resilience community of the Eastern Shore. There's often been a set of actors that are talking about coastal flooding, and then the people that are dealing with young people in the schools and you know, the Black churches. And so it's a really wonderful way to get people talking across difference and about the things actually that they all care about, which are often, you know, getting their young people to school, making sure that they, you know, their elders can get their medicines, all of that kind of shared values. We've found that for those of you that do research, the internal review board is still really learning. I think this is an international phenomenon, it seems. When I'm talking to my peers across the country, they're still really learning what co-produced research is. So it was actually a really big challenge because we were paying people for their time, because we were taking very seriously the formation of our research questions with community peers. Was actually harder to get through, which was, I found really interesting from a research ethics perspective. And then there's also, you know, a fair amount of extractive research history across the state of Virginia. And so there's a real, even though a real enthusiasm to engage in this project, there's a real hesitancy to engage in anything that looks like traditional research, like a focus group. Even though it's mostly like food and storytelling, it's still thought of as a potentially extractive form of engagement. And so we're doing a lot more kind of, you know, the history timeline is also a place to talk about, you know, your challenges in the future, and we can take that to an oyster roast. So there are different ways to engage in what it means to do research together, what it means to produce knowledge together. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, some of the most important challenges to talk through are also deeply personal. So we're finding that moving from focus groups to interviews makes sense for a lot of the people that want to have some honest conversation, and they don't really want to tell their boss that they might be criticizing the place that they work or their friends work. And we are finding that young people understand and are ready to talk about climate change so much more than many of the decision makers have at least in their, you know, in the way that they think about the work. So we've been working with a middle school teacher who has the middle school students conducted interviews and ask family members from many different generations their climate stories, and then did beautiful artwork based on that. There's some really, really compelling pieces of art, you know, inspired by this work. And then an amalgamation of that art became a mural that you see in this slide that was painted during Earth Day this year. So just really some pretty rich relationships with the young people. And just to kind of reconnect as I finish and hand us back the baton to Q&A. We're right in the middle. We're finding ways to collectively learn, but also starting to think, as Karen mentioned, about stewardship, about how we are, as a group, building shared capacity to make great decisions, to continue this tool to not be so heavy with data that it can't be nimbly and updated and kind of have a life of its own. So figuring out how to tell those stories in ways that really resonate for not only decision makers in the government, but also the sort of broader public about, how does this affect your life? How does this affect your community? How does this, affect your ability to thrive? So thank you.
So we'd love to hear from you all if you have questions, if you want to put them in the chat. We have about 14 minutes.
We're running really great on time. I did have a question for both of you myself, just listening. Do you have any thoughts on, the trust building it takes for work like this? And, when you talked about the oral histories, like how do you go about getting those things down and talking to community members?
Yeah. So one of our key partners on the environmental side is Dr. Cora Baird. She has worked with Dr. Karen McGlathery a long time. She also is from the Eastern Shore. Her parents are teachers and farmers. So she was a really key person to sort of have always in that moment of translation as we were setting up conversations and building trust. And then for the most part, and I'll kind of try to answer, I see Reagan has a question about how did you find your first community leaders you mentioned? So this is, I'll sort of answer both Brea and Reagan's question here. For the most part, what happened was Cora was understanding that we needed to think differently and break outside of the normal kind of environmental molds. And in the summer of 2020, Karen Downing, the wonderful pastor that you saw in the video and our one of our key co-PIs, was leading a set of racial justice workshops, all on Zoom. This was mid-pandemic, and people were really struggling to on the Eastern Shore to talk more about racial justice work and the needs there. Just more directly and with, kind of getting their comfort level across the region together. And this is work I've been working in the Equity Center where we're doing this often and trying to disaggregate data to have conversations that are data rich, but community driven. So Cora reached out to Karen and who was doing amazing follow-up work even after that set of events and said, hey, is this something that would be useful to you? And shared some of what we've done at the Equity Center in terms of disaggregating data for racial justice. And Karen was like, absolutely, yes. And actually let me bring in a colleague of mine, Andre. We're both in leadership. They actually didn't know each other that well. They're from the two different counties, but they'd worked on a few projects and realized that they had shared goals. And it's their trust that is so key. So I wouldn't say that that we could build anything like the trust we have if it weren't for Karen and Andre being the leads on really everything we do. And so our trust with Karen and Andre, I think, is earned every day by continuing to really listen, to defer, to share power, to share resources in ways that are respectful of their brilliance and their time. Like they could absolutely be here and running things today, but they're also really busy people with lives. So I think we also try to balance what's going to be good for them and make sure that they're centered whenever it's good for them, and then also really respect their time. Karen, do you have anything to add?
Yeah,
there?
I was just going to add that when we have the community workshops that we showed slides of, it's Karen and Andre who are the face of the project with the community. They're the ones that are talking about what it's about. It's not us. We're always in the background. So they're just such an integral part. They're the ones that are communicating with people, talking with people. We're supporting them in that context, I think, which is really important. And when we started this interaction with Karen and Andre, we weren't really talking about climate. We were talking about how do you keep youth on the Eastern Shore when people are starting to flee? And that is just such a fundamental question. As you saw in the video, Karen was talking about thriving. How do we make this community thrive? And so we developed relationships with them before the project was funded. And I think that was important. There was a question about why, I think, Barbara, in terms of what makes people think about extractive research. There's, I guess, some of that came from a focus group where, the thought was, if you're a scientist from a university, you're not, I don't really want to hear from you. Sometimes it was that kind of closed door based on previous experience. I mean, there's been a lot of great work that's been done on the Eastern Shore. Not a lot of it has been community engaged in this way. In fact, very little of it. And so I think there was a little bit of, there's a lot of trepidation, I guess, like, who are you and what are you doing here? There's a very much an identity of place with the Eastern Shore. You're either born here or come here. And, the come heres are sometimes, especially academics, viewed with some degree of skepticism. So that just really underscores the value of having our community leaders as a part of our team, as the face of the project, as a very, very authentic face of the project. They're not just, faces that don't contribute. They really strongly contribute. Barbara, there was a question about Indigenous ancestral knowledge and whether we're working with tribal communities. I don't know if you want to touch on that, and then I can touch on another one that came up.
Yeah, and just to finish the Reagan, in terms of our process, we went through a stakeholder analysis with Karen and Andre and Cora, all having a lifetime of experience on the Eastern Shore, and we really tried to think through all of the key nodes of impact and connection to the place now. Also those groups that are most significantly burdened by climate risk, and making sure that there was some kind of key person who was in a role that was really a paid role where they could be present for massive amounts of meetings over a 5-year period. And then made sure that those people were connected to a whole community of people that would be willing to, to give smaller amounts of time as their capacity allowed. So that it was a stakeholder analysis process that, and some power mapping. In terms of Indigenous ancestral knowledge, when it comes to stewardship and even just tribal community involvement, we haven't had a ton of tribal community involvement yet. We really try to be led fully by our local community partners. It's something I'm personally incredibly passionate about. So I'm very eager to find ways to incorporate and learn from, the sort of traditional stewards of the land. In this case, it hasn't been a key voice that the community advisory committee has said, oh, we have to have this group of people. From what I understand, there really has been a loss of that set of active residents on the Eastern Shore. So it's a gap for us, and I think there's a lot of ways in which there's Indigenous thinking happening on the Eastern Shore. I would love, Denise, if you're living on the Eastern Shore, I would be so excited to talk to you because yes, it would be wonderful to learn anything that anyone is willing to share in that regard. We are, I think, really, thank you so much. That's exciting. So yeah, I think we're learning every day about how to build the wisest tent we can build. So learning something today too. But yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. We have about 5 minutes, and I wanted to, there was one question you can see from Ralph Durstein, if I'm pronouncing it right, about how we come down with residents on the issue of retreat versus fortify to combat sea level rise. Some areas are so vulnerable it can't make sense to fight, but how can they leave the land behind? That's a really really tough issue, and I think Barbara and I could both speak to that. We don't walk into a community and say, everything's so dire, you need to move. I mean, a resident like Cora said, our site director feels that way herself as a resident. We do our best to listen and to be responsive to what people's concerns are. And in providing these maps and these data-rich sort of visualization of what it looks like now, what it'll look like in 10 years and 20 years and 30 years, is a way to help people make decisions, but not advocate for a specific decision. It's really challenging on the Eastern Shore. I mean, if Denise is here, who's who lives there, there are a lot of folks who've been there for, 10 generations or more. There's a real strong sense of place. So we're not in a position to advocate for, we don't even really touch it in that directive way right now. Wouldn't you say that, Barbara?
Yeah, I think we're trying to be just deeply respectful of the lived experience guiding the process here, and that's not what people want to. They're focused on that they've always lived, and they've always lived with water. They've always lived with the land. They want to know how to kind of maintain a sort of web of support for all of the people that might be impacted, and how to make good decisions along those lines. But yeah, we're not telling anyone what to do.
We have a few more minutes if anyone has additional questions. And I'm glad, Denise, that you've connected with us.
Yeah.
And
I'm
Barbara
sorry
will
you-
definitely be in touch with you. A new message. Yes. Annie O'Connell has an additional comment about Indigenous people and reaching out. We do have one member of our team, Elizabeth Andrews, who works with Indigenous communities across the state and thinking about climate resilience. So she is a person who is also, like Barbara, deeply interested in this issue and making sure the voices are at the table. Elizabeth has worked with the state government on the Coastal Resilience Task Force that I also am part of, advising the governor, last governor, and this current one. How do you build equity into the project, and did you face pushback from the administration? We did not face any pushback from the administration. Our administration at UVA is very much foundationally supportive of equity research. In fact, Barbara co-founded the Equity Center at UVA. I think sort of a kind of related issue is that the National Science Foundation said to me last week, the people who gave us money, like, we don't really expect you to know what you're going to do in year 4 and 5, because we're anticipating that your research is going to change based on how you're interacting with the community, and we value that. That's a really new perspective in federal funding of research, which I think is really important. So we have 2-minute warning. Brea suggests we talk a little bit about challenges. The challenges, I guess, for the community members. So septic failures for sure was something that came up from the community that we hadn't really been thinking about. And so we're really working at how to direct our research towards that. Having fresh water for drinking, but also for supporting farming is a really important issue as well. I guess another challenge that folks are facing that I mentioned in the beginning was the idea of road washouts. We weren't really thinking about that either. When we first started this project, we were really thinking about saltwater intrusion into groundwater. So I think those are really key issues. And just to emphasize that those came from working with the community. We didn't just march in and say, this is what we're going to do, and this is what the end result is. So I hope if you get nothing else from that, that's something that you take away from this presentation. We've learned a lot, Barbara and I and the other team members, about how to take our ability, our knowledge to put it to good use in this particular location. And we hope we're building partnerships that are going to last for a very long time. So I think we're at 2:50, Brea, correct? So we should probably end, but thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you all. This was an excellent presentation. We hope to see you all again soon. Take care.